السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام
أعوذ
ورحمة
بالله من
الله
الشيطان
وبركاته.
الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من أن نقول زورا أو أن نخشى فجورا أو أن نكون بك من المغرورين. وبعد. I'd like to welcome all the brothers and sisters for this session with Shaykh Yasir Qadhi. Before we start, I have few changes in the schedule. Inshallah, for this session, which is scheduled between 6:15 and 7:30, we will end at 7:15 to give more time for dinner. Dinner was very tight.
That's because I spoke.
And the next session, instead of 8:45, will start at 9 o'clock. So for this session, we will finish at 7:15, inshallah. And the next session, which is the conference introduction, instead of 8:45, will start at 9 o'clock. The lecture today, inshallah, will give Shaykh Yasir about 35-40 minutes to talk, inshallah, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. He will talk about flashpoints from our community's past, the lessons and the takeaways that can inform how we build towards our future. Bit of introduction about Shaykh Yasir, although I'm sure many of you know him. He is currently the Dean of Academic Affairs at Maghrib Institute and the man behind the curriculum and Summit. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from here at the University of Houston. And he, at the Islamic University of Medina, he earned his bachelor from the College of Hadith, an MA in Islamic theology from the College of Dawah. He is completing his PhD in religious studies at Yale University, and he wrote several books, including Riya, the Hidden Shirt, Dua, the Weapon of the Believer. Shaykh Yasir is a native Estonian. His family has been here for many years. His father and his family is involved in da'wah. I know a lot of them for many years, so we're very pleased to have him now. And I'll give him the floor for about 40 minutes, inshallah, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers.
جزاكم الله خير. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد. As usual, lectures are very awkward events for me, believe it or not. The reason being, even though I lecture all the time, the reason being that there's so much to say and so little time to say it in. The reason being that microphones go on and off. The reason being that a lot of times topics need to be discussed with particular audiences, particular backgrounds, particular specialities. And in a lecture audience, you need to speak about a topic generically, i.e. for the entire audience. And it's not enough to really build an expertise. And a lot of times it's too specialized even for the beginner. So a topic like this, what I decided to do was to give an example rather than points. Just to trace one example through Islamic history to get an idea of a very simple question. This question is as follows. Why is it that the Islamic Ummah, once upon a time, ruled the world, rose to the very top, and then now is basically at the very bottom? It's not even considered to be an intellectual or an economic power anymore. I mean, the number one power after this country is China or India or something. We're not even on the equation. Why is it that once upon a time we were this civilization and now we are no longer? Of course, the question like this cannot be answered in 20 dissertations, much less a 20-minute lecture. But I wanted to shed some light, to give one example, just one example, going through history, to get an idea of some of the differences of the past, and then the decline, and then the current times. And to answer the question simplistically, There are two causes that have caused us to rise and then to decline. I'm not going to concentrate on the first of those causes because we have heard the first cause over and over again, and that is spirituality or religion. That's number one cause. The Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, of course we respect them and we love them, but civilizational-wise they were not rivals to Rome and Persia. Don't get me wrong here. They were the best of mankind, but they were not as militarily, as politically powerful as Rome and Persia. They didn't have the civilization, they didn't have the architecture, they didn't have the language, they didn't even have a script of a culture. They had nothing. And yet, they had the Quran, and they had Iman. And that caused them to spread from this small land of Arabia to basically conquer the Sassanid Empire and to shake the foundations of the Byzantine Empire. That was nothing but Iman. They didn't have military might. They didn't have the weaponry of the Romans, but they had Iman. So that's something we always hear about. Allah will not change your situation until you change yourselves. When we change for the better, the situation will change. That's very true. But there's also another factor, and that factor we rarely talk about. Or at least many of our circles that we interact with rarely talk about. And that is the Sahaba understood that they needed to acquire those skills that they didn't have. The Sahaba understood that even though they didn't have that particular knowledge of administration, of bureaucracy, of running a military army, of having a naval force, of running an empire, they didn't have that knowledge. They didn't have that background. Most of the Sahaba could not even read and write. And yet they were appointed governors. And yet they were ruling over large areas of land. How did they do that? Did we ever stop to think? It wasn't just Iman. Iman didn't cause the taxes to come in and the roads to be built. You understand what I'm saying here? There was a sense of responsibility, a sense of we need to go beyond our narrow spheres. And therefore what we find from the Sahaba, Tabi'un, Tabi'un, what we find from the earliest generations was an openness, a willingness to acquire skills, to gain professions from people from all around the world. And most of the early bureaucrats, this is something you're not usually taught in Sunday school, most of the people who actually ran the Umayyad Empire, in the very beginning phase of the Umayyad Empire, were not even Muslims. The bureaucrats, they were not Muslims. Because the Muslim Empire, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, his son and his children after him in the Umayyad Empire, they did not have experience in running a whole land. But when they conquered Syria, when they conquered Palestine, when they conquered Iran and Iraq, these were civilizations that already had an infrastructure. So they did the smartest thing imaginable. They took that infrastructure and they allowed it to operate and they ruled over it. And they learned the skill in the language. For the first 35 years or so, even the language of the government was not Arabic. The dawaween or the registers, they were written in Latin, they were written in Persian, because it was too early for them to do so. They didn't have their own currency. The first to give their currency was, as you know, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. They didn't have an Islamic currency. The Prophet ﷺ did not institute a calendar. Today's khutbah, for those of you who attended, I talked about this. Umar ibn al-Khattab was the one who realized, look, we don't have a calendar. He didn't say bid'ah, he didn't say haram, he said we need a calendar. So he made a calendar. They had a willingness to differentiate between what can we change and what can we not change. Right? And to give you one example, the example I wanted to give was that of something that is ubiquitous. Every one of you has it right now. Paper. Paper. This is a very interesting example about mentalities of generations of Islam versus something that is technologically neutral, and that is paper. Paper was invented by the Chinese. Nothing to do with Islam. We didn't invent paper. Paper was invented by the Chinese at around 100 or so CE. But the Chinese kept it very secret, and they didn't understand its importance for writing. They still wrote on papyrus. Paper is much better than papyrus, for many reasons. We don't have time to get into that, right? Paper is what everybody uses in our times. When the Chinese discovered how to make paper, they kept it an elite art. They kept it a luxury item. So they trained a few people, and those people kept on training others to make paper. It was a secret process. And the world still used papyrus. The Muslims, they had a number of battles with the Chinese. And in a very insignificant battle, a battle that has hardly any political consequence, but it has an immense consequence for paper, the Battle of Tal'as. in the year 751 CE. The Battle of Qal'as, it's completely inconsequential in the grand scale of things except for one point. They managed to acquire 2 prisoners of war who were a part of the secret guild that knew how to make papers. So these Chinese, the Battle of Qal'as, it took place in modern day Kyrgyzstan. Modern day Kyrgyzstan, a Muslim empire fighting some Chinese forces, the Han dynasty, H-A-N, and in Kyrgyzstan they conquered these 2 prisoners of war, and they immediately discovered these 2 prisoners of war were a part of that guild, the secret paper-making guild. What did they do? They sent them under armed guard to the capital. These are not your regular prisoners of war. These are VIP prisoners of war. They understood immediately, we have access to something very few people in the world do. And they recognized this. They sent them to the capital. And the Chinese papermakers showed their skills, demonstrated their skills to the Khalifa. They showed them what is paper. The Khalifa said, your ransom to go back to China will be to teach us how to make paper. This is your ransom. You have to teach us how to make paper and you go back to China. Khalas. No money, no nothing. And of course, they weren't the first to do this. The Prophet ﷺ in the Battle of Badr, what was the ransom he put on some of the prisoners of war? You need to teach our kids how to read and write. And then you go back to Mecca. So the Khalifa of the time said, your ransom is to teach these Muslims how to make paper, how to produce paper. And so the very first paper producing mill outside of China opened up in Samarkand. Outside of China opened up in Samarkand. And that was followed in Baghdad and in other Muslim cities. And instantaneously, paper began to be used to write books, to write manuscripts, to write a hadith, Quran, tafsir. It coincided with the intellectual mushrooming of Islamic sciences. And to this day, we have thousands of manuscripts. You see with papyrus, it erodes, it fades away. Papyrus is natural material that after 1,000 years, after 700 years, you don't have it anymore. That's why we don't have papyrus that the Prophet himself wrote on. We don't have leather fragments that he wrote on. They're all gone because it's too long. But paper lasts, and paper is lighter, and paper is better, and paper is cleaner, and paper is neater, and paper is this and that. So paper began to spread everywhere. And the Muslims took this science from the Chinese and began to develop upon it. They made better paper than the Chinese. They introduced new techniques. Not the time to get into that now, I'm not even the expert, but they introduced new techniques. They had different types of mills. They had different types of machines to pound, to mesh through all of the wood, because paper comes from wood and pulp, right? So they invented ways to manufacture better paper. And they also decided that, the Chinese, and even before them, the Jews, not on paper but on parchment, they would scroll things up. You know this, they would scroll it up, right? The Muslims decided it makes a lot more sense to stack them together. Once you stack it together, you need to bind it. So they decided we need to bind the books. Now that you have a binded book, well, you need something to cover it because the first and the last pages always go bad. So they made thick cardboards that they put on top. And so the modern structure of the book has come from 7th, 8th century Baghdad. The modern structure, the books all over the world. You do not find this type of book before the Muslims invent the structure of books, right? Of course, now we have the Kindle and the e-book and all that. Forget all that, right? In the good old days, we had actual physical books. You kids don't even know what a book is. But once upon a time, we had physical books, right? Books that, this structure of the book, to have a cover, to have a binding, to have it bounded together, this came from the Muslims. Because they wanted knowledge, and they needed this knowledge to spread. So Islam became known for education, civilization. Islam became known for teaching. Islam became known for scholarship. And Christian Europe, of course, at this time was in the Dark Ages. Because Muslims had no problems acquiring sciences from other people. And that's why they had no problems going to the Greeks, going to the Romans, getting their books. When they found the libraries of Alexandria, they grasped these opportunities. And they took all of this, the good and the bad. There's no doubt that some of these translation movements produced some negative things as well. But overall, the Muslims understood, look, we have the truth in Islam, but that doesn't mean we're the best chemists. That doesn't mean we're the best physicists. That doesn't